Hello and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Doug Buchanan, a member of CMC's board, and by day I'm editor-in-chief of Columbus Business First. Welcome everybody who made it here in person. It is great to see you. Live streaming today is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation with support from the Columbus Dispatch and PNC. We'd also like to thank those of you watching today who purchased a virtual seat. We're very grateful for the support and are able to continue live streaming services in large part because of you, so thank you. CMC's political forums are sponsored by Hannah News Service and the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation. Won't you please help me in thanking all of our sponsors today. Okay. The vote is in, and while we may still be doing some legal maneuverings, I think we can declare that Joe Biden is the president-elect of the United States. But to say it was an unprecedented election and now an unprecedented post-election is quite the understatement. There is much to discuss, so let's get right to it. Please welcome our speakers. First off, political consultant, educator, and founder of Communications Counsel, Mark Weaver. The professor, yeah, please give him a hand, sure. Associate Professor of Political Science at Otterbein University, Trice, Washington. Go ahead for Trice. And Professor Emeritus, OSU Department of Political Science and the preeminent political guru of our time, Herb Asher. Yay. The Herb Asher. And our host, journalist at the Ohio Statehouse News Bureau, Joe Ingles. Joe, the podium is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I don't want to talk long. I want to get right to it because I know there are a lot of things to talk about in this one. So first of all, let's go down the line. And Mark, what happened last week?
Well, a couple things happened. There's been more evidence of our country roughly dividing half and half on most things. Pick a topic and you can pretty much guess that the country's split on it about half and half. And so nationally we know that, but in Ohio, I think it's fair to say that the bellwether has been unrung. The notion of Ohio as a purple state is slowly going away. I predicted this to your colleague Andy Chow 4 years ago on election night. He was interviewing me this past election night last week, and he says, Mark, you know, is Ohio purple or red? And I said, I think it's red. And Andy says, you know, I think we had this exact interview election night 2016, and you told me the same thing. And I said, yes, my home state of Pennsylvania is now purple. We used to be blue. And I think the big change for Ohio is that there will be less competition for Republican statewide office holders now that it looks pretty clear that we are a fairly red state.
Latrice, what are your thoughts on that?
I think what we've seen is democracy in action. I also think, and know, as many of us do, elections are increasingly divisive, okay, in a way that everyday life isn't. There's some division, but it gets highly exaggerated when we get into an election cycle. So we've had a pandemic, you know, COVID, to wear a mask, not to wear a mask. People are divided on that. Should we believe the science? Is the science wrong? People are divided on that. Social justice, people are divided on that. White supremacy, people are divided on that. Racism, people are divided on that. Gender, people are already divided on that. So we've seen in the choices between the two dominant candidates that division and people simply going in the direction of the candidate that they believed would be more beneficial. We know it's not a win-win for any demographic. You take wins and you take losses as it pertains to even whoever the candidate is that wins. You won't get everything in policy that you want, and it won't look like what you want it to look like. So I think people still have a little bit of a distorted perspective on that, and perhaps that's why whether it's a win for red or a win for blue, we don't like to lose. And so what we're seeing now is, again, democracy in action. Everyone has a right to believe what he or she wants to believe. As a voter, to vote the way he or she wants to. At the end of the day, majority rule is the core value. Minority, out of power, will have rights to representation and participation to fully be engaged. We will wait until December 14th for the state legislatures to be filled with the electors, and let them do what they do, which I believe will be represent the popular vote and the will of the people on Election Day. From that point, we can sulk, but we do need to work on coming back together, trying to heal, to be as united as we potentially were before. And so we'll see. But that's where we are. We are the United States of America, and every division that has been present in our societies from history was exacerbated during this period.
Herb Asher, your thoughts?
I'm glad somebody's very optimistic. So, first of all, I agree with Mark. I think Ohio now, you have to call it a pink state. And maybe Democrats could be competitive if the Republicans nominated Nino Vitale for governor or something like that. But he's not here, is he? But look, last week, Joe Biden won the presidency, and the Republicans nationally had a very good night. Let's not forget that. The GOP picked up seats in the U.S. House. We don't know the final number yet. They kept control of the U.S. Senate, and they're not likely to lose it in the 2 Georgia elections. It looks like no state legislatures flipped from Republican to Democratic. And remember, before the election, there were all these predictions about how it might be a blue wave, and it wasn't a blue wave. And in fact, I can make an argument that Donald Trump himself, in some states, had coattails that actually helped underdog Republican incumbents hold on to their seats. And Trump himself ran better in 2020 than he did in 2016. But Joe Biden ran a lot better than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. So I had been thinking about the future of the parties if Biden had lost or if Trump had lost. And let me just do the hypothetical. If Biden had lost, the narrative from a lot of Democratic activists, particularly the coastal activists, would be, we nominated too moderate a candidate. He wasn't pure on a lot of these issues like the Green New Deal, and he just wasn't progressive enough or whatever. So the lesson they would have learned would, we need a more progressive candidate. And I think that's actually a wrong lesson. You know, you don't have to carry New York by a higher margin than you already do. You don't have to carry California by a higher margin. But you do have to look at other states and see what a democratic message should look like and how it would play. And then I thought that if the Republicans had suffered a bad night, and they did not, and if Trump had lost by a huge margin, then on the Republican side, their post-election battle for control of the party would have begun, and would, in fact, the more mainstream conservative Republicans try to, in a sense, win back control of the party. But now, given what's happened, a reasonably close election outcome, the Republicans doing well in the Congress, and the behavior of Republicans and the president since the election, I think that post-election intra-party battle has already been decided. And it's been decided in favor of Trump and Trump's supporters, and for a number of reasons. And one simply is that there are millions and millions of Trump voters out there. There are many Republican incumbents who still are terrified that the president would have the power to assuming he does step down, of course, the president would have the power to encourage primary challenges and encourage his supporters, which do seem very passionate and very loyal. These Republicans were disloyal to me. Let's take them out in the next election, the midterm election, perhaps. So I think now the party is going to be the Trump party, even when Trump finally concedes, although we'll have to watch to see whether leadership on the Republican side can finally say, oh, never mind, we never really were there. It was all just sort of political opportunity and political opportunism, but we're really not that party. But I think they have a more difficult time today moving forward as a revamped or remodeled Republican Party than they would have had the election outcome been more hurtful to the GOP.
Yeah, And, you know, Mark, you brought up that Ohio is no longer a bellwether, and the points you're bringing up, Herb, about the way that the party is going to go in the future, or the way you see it. Let me ask you, what about these results? What do they mean to the state, to the parties? What do they mean to the future and the nation, given that we are now a little out of step, it appears, with the nation?
Well, I think every 4 years, political scientists, we love to say a realignment is occurring. But most of the time when we say that, it's actually not occurring, because realignments only occur in American politics once a generation, or maybe once every other generation. I remember as a graduate teaching assistant working on my master's in political science, this is the late 80s now, teaching students that one of the core constituencies of the Democratic Party, one of the most reliable constituencies, is the working class, blue-collar voters. We have to now say that that has changed, that is no longer a core constituency of the Democratic Party. This is these are folks who had been reluctant foot soldiers of the Democratic Party, and now they are zealous and energized foot soldiers of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And all you need to do is look at what's going on in the eastern part of the state. Herb, you've been doing politics in Ohio a long time, as have I. Neither you or I would have predicted that Mahoning County would go for the Republican presidential candidate, and in fact, it did this election. The Mahoning Valley went for Trump 4 years ago, but that one county held out and went for Hillary. That's a sign of a realignment, and I think you will see that the strong Democrat challengers that would have stepped forward had this been a weak year for Republicans in Ohio, to run against Mike DeWine in 2 years, to run against Rob Portman in 2 years, to run for the other statewide offices. I think you will see their very best candidates choosing not to run for fear that it would be a lost cause.
So who do you guess will run? Put
Well,
you on
John
the spot.
Cranley's saying he's running for governor out there. I don't know. I don't know who would
Mayor
run against
Cincinnati.
Rob Portman, but all I can say is it probably won't be the best candidates they could field, because those candidates will either A, go into a Biden administration, or B, not be willing to take the drubbing that they'd be likely to take, particularly with the rebound effect after a president wins the White House. His party tends to do poorly in that next congressional cycle. So in Ohio, we're going to have the +8 we got this year, plus whatever rebound effect happens after the first 2 years in the doldrums of a new president.
Latrice or Herb, would either one of you like to respond to that?
You can go ahead, Herb.
Agree with a lot of it, but if you think about Ohio, there are a lot of different movements of voters going on, and the net effect of that is to help the Republican Party. So as Mark said, the Mahoning Valley and Mahoning County and the white working class certainly has moved Republican, although what I really wonder how much of that is due to Donald Trump, because I can make an argument that Donald Trump, with respect to the working class, was a populist. Renegotiate those trade deals, get tough on China, I think there's a reason why Sherrod Brown was able to win and no other Democrat's been able to win in a long time, because he is, even though he's a liberal, he's a working class populist. But there are other movements that are going on. Obviously, the major counties, especially Hamilton and Franklin County, are becoming more Democratic. Those of us who have been around for a long time can remember that Franklin County, when you voted in statewide elections, Franklin County was more Republican than the state average.
And every row office was a Republican office holder.
Yeah, exactly.
And now they're gone.
Exactly. And so you see the major counties becoming more Democratic, but that's not enough to win. We also see some movement going on in some of the prosperous, highly educated ring counties. And so we, in fact, saw this time that Joe Biden, even though we didn't win Delaware, did a lot better than Hillary Clinton did. And Hillary Clinton actually did better in Delaware County than Barack Obama did. And that sort of surprises people. And that's important because, in fact, even if you don't win a county, you want to reduce your margin of defeat. So we're seeing that, and that's sort of sometimes summarized too simplistically. Oh, it's the suburban, educated, white, college-educated women. It's more than that. But it may be the case that some of that is also driven by Donald Trump. In this case, driving people away from the party. Many people saying, I didn't leave the Republican Party left me. But that's an area where the Democrats are picking up votes. But then you look at Western Ohio. always Republican, socially conservative area. And if you look over the last number of election cycles, the Republican margin is just growing. There were counties in which Donald Trump got 80% of the vote. Democrats will never carry those counties, but it makes a world of difference whether you lose them 60-40 or 80-20. And then southeastern Ohio, which used to have some residual Democratic support going way back in terms of the old immigration patterns. You know, Southern whites moving up to, and who were Democratic, moving into Ohio, moving in southeastern Ohio. But obviously, even back then, culturally alienated from the Democratic Party, and that area is becoming more Republican. So when you look at the areas that are moving Republican and the areas that are moving Democrat, the Republicans really have the advantage right now, which means they also, which means the Democrats have a more difficult time finding a candidate who can hit sort of the sweet spot and have a broader appeal.
Yeah. Latrice, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I would say is in reference to the Democratic Party, it's not in their best interest to allow the incumbents to run unchallenged. The benefit is, even if the expectation is because Ohio is red, maybe we might want to say pink, the reality is it is never in the best interest of any party to just let another party take a win uncontested. Now, from the other perspective of having people in the well, recruiting, allowing people to run, hopefully run as best as they can, strategically figure out what worked well with, even if I lost, what did we do well? What types of lessons can we learn from this? Maybe I have to run 2 or 3 times to get that win. And having people vested enough in the party and in seeking those offices to be willing to take a possible loss, as opposed to needing a sure thing, or the appearance of a sure thing to run. And I think that, too, is in the best interest of democracy, not just in the nation, but also in the state, because people need options, they need choices. And void of that, we oftentimes get, once again, the lack of participation from citizens because they don't feel like there are options for them, even if the option that they want is an option that politically is a losing option numerically.
Now, going back to what Herb was talking about the rural areas and the suburban areas, we saw a strong divide in this election between what the rural areas did, what the suburban areas did, what the cities did. How does that work going forward?
Well, it says for the Democratic Party that they need to be thinking about 88 counties. They need to be thinking about how do they talk effectively with people in rural areas. Mm-hmm. Not that they're going to change their policies on abortion, because one of the things that really motivates a lot of Western Ohio are socially conservative values, including very strong pro-life values. But if you don't even talk to voters, if you don't even have a presence, that just exacerbates the problem. It's really saying, you know, you really don't even have a face in those areas. Mm-hmm. But I think, in fact, another relevant thing here is that when we talk about the state Democratic Party, there's not really a lot to say about it. It's been a party that's been dominated really by organized labor and some of the African American leaders, but mainly organized labor. And it's not a party that necessarily thinks about, oh, why aren't we now recruiting younger female black candidates and maybe creating a farm team? Mm-hmm. We've had a number of elections in the last 20 years where perhaps if they had been more receptive to an up-and-coming Democrat or a female Democrat, maybe they could have run a stronger race. This is going way back into history, but they didn't have to have Rob Birch as their nominee, who got 25% of the vote. They could have had Jane Campbell. She would have gotten 40% of the vote, or maybe a little bit more. But that's not who the bosses of the party were looking toward. And that election was disastrous because it dragged down every other Democrat or whatever. So there needs to be, but you know, people are talking about Georgia today and Stacey Abrams and what a wonderful job she really did in organizing and mobilizing. I don't want to overstate that, but there really is a need for the state Democratic Party or other organizations to, in fact, step in. We remember, back in 2004, there was this new radical organization called UA for Kerry. And people said, "Oh my goodness, there are Democrats in Upper Arlington, and actually there are a lot of us." And in Delaware County, there were groups, largely women, who in fact were working both in 2016 and 2020. How does the state Democratic Party, maybe they'll get in the way actually, but how does the state Democratic Party facilitate more of that kind of grassroots organizing? Not that you're going to win these counties, but you're going to indeed reduce the margin by which you lose.
Latrice or Mark, do you have anything to add?
The only thing I was going to say is that it'll be interesting in the next 4 years to see how suburbanites vote, right? Was the appearance of voting more like heavily urban areas an effect of what has been playing out? As policies kind of shift, will they remain there? Will they remain a little more liberal statewide? Will it be more liberal on a national scope in terms of national politics? Suburban areas are far more diverse, and that is one area that obviously President Donald Trump had a difficult time with. And from things that he verbally said, it was clear, at least to me, looking at the numbers and the demographics, that he didn't have a good sense of what suburban areas were anymore. What it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the 80s is a very different thing now. The level of diversity is higher. So I also think perhaps wooing suburbanites back, if that is at all what the Republican Party needs to think about, is the language, the rhetoric will need to seem a little more inclusive than it has been. And then we also have to think about race relations in suburban areas. When you level it off because of economics, it doesn't always play out the way that it does in rural areas or in other segments of the population. So that's a little demographic that I'm interested to see in the next 4 years, if that pattern that we've been seeing continues, or if it was just a reaction to Donald Trump in office. So we'll see.
Mark, do you have anything you want to add?
I agree. I think those are pretty sharp comments. Other observers falsely suggest that the suburbs have changed from Democrat to Republican, as if people who from Republican to Democrat, from people who used to be Republicans, now they just feel like they're Democrats. That's not observing how people are moving in America. I grew up in an inner ring suburb of Philadelphia that was among the most Republican parts of Pennsylvania. It is now hardcore Democrat. Trust me, the people who live there have not changed their mind. The people who live there moved to the exurbs. I now live in the exurbs of Columbus, and I'm in a very red part of the state. And so if you look at little animated maps of how people move, people leave the urban areas and they move to the next suburb they feel most comfortable with, and then people leave the suburbs and they go to the next exurb that they feel comfortable with. So some of this is people not moving and changing their minds, but most of this is Democrat voters who had been voting in cities are now voting in suburbs, and Republican voters who have been voting in suburbs now voting in exurbs.
That's a perfect lead into what I wanted to talk about next. It seemed like in this election, we saw a lot of young people come out to vote who hadn't come out to vote before. We saw a lot of people across all ages actually coming out, but especially young people and people of color were coming out and actually voting in this election. What effect do you think that had on the whole thing? Latrice, maybe I could start with you since you have students.
I can say that Otterbein in particular, and I know many campuses throughout the country and especially in the state, were organizing not to get our students to vote in a particular way, but to get them to actively embrace this concept of being citizens in a republic where the power is with the people, it's government of the people, for the people, by the people. So you are the people. You don't magically become the people because you turn 24, 25, 26 and now have certain life responsibilities where you see the implications of policies and governmental decisions. Get engaged now, start to learn now, because if mathematically there's some truth to the amount of time that it takes to kind of really get it, let's say about 30, 33 years, that will still put you ahead of the curve of waiting until you're a senior citizen to get it. There is power there, it's legitimate power. And so we spent a lot of time with that. I can say most of my students were split down the middle. Trump, Biden, and for very different reasons. And for whatever rationale they used, rightly so. But I think what we've seen this go around is, the numbers are suggesting people were better able to motivate that 18 to 24, 18 to 26-year-old demographic. And somehow they found an attachment, whether someone had to help them articulate it or communicate so that they can find a link to why should I vote. Whether it was civic engagement or particular issues. For some it was abortion. For some it was the fact that they believe the opposite, which they may be pro-life in their personal life, but politically they don't believe that a government should tell a woman how to control her body, that she should be free to make those choices for herself. So we saw that fight out. But we also, Otterbein in particular, we had bans, faculty, staff, administrators, everyone worked to just make sure we got those who wanted to be at the polls to the polls. Then the weird thing that we had to figure out was, how do we work with the absentee ballots for the students that were quarantined? Mm-hmm. And we had to figure out how to deliver those, because technically speaking, you're not supposed to deliver someone else's ballot, and you can't do it in bulk.
Right. Herb or Mark, do you have anything to add? Or?
Let me just first disagree a little with Mark about what's happening in outlying counties. I mean, we can in fact say even within Franklin County, the composition of Upper Arlington is changing. That's why it's Democratic, and the composition of Grandview Heights and Bexley and going on and on. But there's also a phenomenon, and it doesn't have to be a party switch, like somehow I was a Republican today and now I'm a Democrat. It can be either a short-term defection, somebody in transition, people saying, where is the Republican Party going? I'll vote for the Republican statewide candidate, but I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump. And then you start asking the question, at what point do you have a sort of tipping effect where you have really lost people? And it doesn't have to be a large number. Remember, most of our elections are decided at the margins. So if you can gain 5% among a certain group or add increased turnout by a little bit, that could determine the outcome in a competitive state. So, but where I agree with both the speakers is that I think some of the Democratic gains are really driven by Donald Trump. And I wish we could in fact see among some of those Delaware County voters, for example, how did they cast the rest of their ballot? Did they stick with the Republicans, and this is really a defection, and they're waiting to see what might happen? I do think the Republicans have a tremendous advantage, but when you have a tremendous advantage, then you might start saying any of our candidates can win, and then you start thinking, okay, who's going to succeed? Will there be a primary challenge to Mike DeWine? Will somebody from the right wing of the party try to challenge him? Will Donald Trump endorse that right winger? Will that right winger win the primary? And then I would actually say Democrats are going to be, if they get a good candidate for governor, will win. But I think, in fact, there's more going on the Republican side that we don't see. And again, it's not great. I mean, it's not a large amount. But elections are decided by the margins, at the margins.
What do you think about that,
I'm
Mark?
not sure that you and I disagree that much. I think, because I agree with you that much of what we're seeing in suburbs is a reaction to Donald Trump. And I've lamented this to friends and folks around the country and different reporters who've called me, is the politics of the greatest nation the world has ever known should not revolve around the personality or celebrity of a particular person. We are too great a country for that. And it is a juvenile and immature view of American politics to go, I love Donald Trump, therefore my politics are driven by my love of Donald Trump, or I hate Donald Trump, therefore my politics are driven by my hatred of Donald Trump. 2 years ago in the Cincinnati Enquirer, I wrote an op-ed with the headline, "The People Misunderstand the Role of the President." And in it, I made the case that so many people focus on who the president is, and their political well-being feelings are driven by who the president is. Yet our founding fathers were very careful to take the power that government has over people and cut it up 9 ways. Legislative, judicial, executive this way, federal, state, local this way, and they take each piece of it and they give it to different people. So the state legislative piece is shared by thousands of state legislators across the country. The local judicial piece is shared by thousands of judges across the country. Yet too many people, not the folks on this panel, and my guess is not the most people watching here, because the fact that you're tuning in suggests that you're more politically sophisticated. Too many people in America think this is tabloid celebrity stuff. Oh, Donald Trump, he was the TV star. I have strong feelings about him. It might be because I think he's cool or I think he's terrible. And then somehow that defines who you are as a shareholder in American government. I'm troubled by that.
When you talk about the youth vote, there's a little bit more evidence to suggest that as young people begin to get involved in politics, they are sort of imprinted by the dominant, by the president.
Well, they are, sure.
And
Yeah.
that may, so for example, we have some evidence that young people who came of political age and got involved when Ronald Reagan was president, he was an impressive person. He was an inspirational person.
That was my generation.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that's true.
And there was an imprint there where you had younger people saying, well, I'm sort of, they were more Republican than the previous generation. Didn't mean they subscribed to all the policy positions, but they just affectively felt good. I can imagine this time around, if young people associate the Republican Party as the Donald Trump Party, they may be imprinted with, and again, it won't be large numbers, but again, they may be going then through the life cycle with a little bit of an advantage for the Democrats because of this early imprinting.
And one thing I would like to say, because I do agree with you, there's this misnomer in terms of the intent of the framers when it comes to the presidency. And when we read Article 2, it was very clear, disproportionately to be a check on Congress. And it seems as though out of convenience for having the ability to watch a one man or one or two-man institution, right? It's easier to watch the White House as opposed to turn on C-SPAN and try to figure out what these hundreds of people are doing and trying to maneuver parliamentary procedure. I've even had students go, oh, they voted on that bill 4 times. I'm like, no, the first is to close debate. The next is for passage. And it's that level of understanding that separates very sophisticated members of the electorate from those of us that may be novices or kind of tune in and tune out, but it's very dangerous. The Declaration of Independence is very clear. There was a strong fear of a tyrannical king. They were not trying to create an institution that could become a tyrannical king, an authoritarian type of leader that could even shift into like a dictatorship. But that's what many, especially young people, see, and many Americans, even beyond age, have gotten sucked into social media and even celebrity. And so that plays out well on a reality TV show. This is reality, not a reality TV show. And so when we understand that, everyone loves a villain on a reality TV show. He or she keeps that show interesting where people tune in. But this is democracy where real rights, real privileges, the core of what is promised to every human being as it relates to unalienable rights is expected to be preserved. After all, we have trumpeted ourselves around the world as this beacon that needs to be respected and that essentially has told other governments the way they do it is wrong. And now they're looking at us saying, you big hypocrites. Either you believe what is promised on paper and you intend to extend it, or you don't. And if we don't, let's just say it. Let's just say it. If we don't, let's be honest and say it. Let's not do the lip service and do something contrary, because that's not love of nation. And the last point I will make is this kind of concept of patriotism. When I talk to my students, oftentimes they're like, oh no, you have to love your country. Yes, but love also says when something is wrong, you call it wrong. When something is right, you support it. But when it's wrong, you hold it accountable. Why? Because without that, not only a nation, but as individuals, we self-destruct. And so when we love people, we sometimes have to say the things we don't want to say that are uncomfortable, and we have to tell the truths that are absolutely necessary. And so I think we're at a stage in this country where what is going to prevail, truth or lies?
Okay, and on that note, we'll move to questions from our audience in just a few minutes. We hope to have some live audience questions, and we'll have some questions from our live stream audience as well. But before we go to that, let me ask you about the polarization. It seems like this election, the polarization is just through the roof. Okay? And now we're starting to see, even on social media, we're seeing Parler, we're seeing other social media outlets come into play where that polarization is taken to yet another level. What effect does that have on elections going forward and on democracy in general? Mark?
Well, this week, Newsweek magazine published my column that was the headline, Trump didn't cause the national division and Biden can't heal it. And the premise of my piece in Newsweek this week was that the divide that we are all rightfully concerned about right now has been with us for some time. The notion of it being unique to Donald Trump is false. Barack Obama came to national presence in 2004 in a famous speech where he lamented that we have been divided red and blue. And these divisions have been with us for the better part of 20 years. Are they getting worse every year? I think they are. And the key, of course, is to come together behind national ideals. I was so moved by what you said about our national ideals, about patriotism and what the Declaration says. And I talk about that in this column. And so I think that's how we get to unity. But I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we think that the disunity is something recent.
Okay, I know we're trying to get to the audience questions. Real quickly, Herb, Latrice, do you have anything to add to that, or do you want to go ahead and go to questions?
The polarization has gotten worse in the last couple of weeks. You'll start looking at the public opinion polls and questions asked of Americans. Do you think the election was fair and honest? Do you think President Trump was robbed of this? And that's another level. It's one thing to be polarized on certain values that are, that are in dispute at times, or certain policies. But if you now are saying that we don't believe, or a large number of people don't believe in the legitimacy of our institutions, and maybe some people will even act on that, then we should worry more about what other nations in the world think about us, because we will not be the role model for democracy. And I think the next couple of weeks will be very significant to see who steps up and really tries to foster a smooth transition. Last comment. And so those of us who get nervous when the defense secretary is replaced and then the people below him get replaced, and they're talking about getting rid of the CIA director and they're changing the personnel in the national security account, we say, oh, it can happen here. And then I think about Stephen Miller and some of the people around Donald Trump, and I'm thinking, can the institution, because we're all saying we believe the institutions are strong and we can withstand anything, and this might be a test coming up.
Mm-hmm. I see that Director Scott, Jane Scott, is at the mic here, and she has some questions. So let's go ahead and go to her.
We have some great questions. One from Mike Curtin that I want to go to first. Can you comment on the Brookings data? The Brookings data showed Biden won 477 counties that have 70% of America's economic activity. Trump won 2,497 counties with 29% of the nation's economic activity.
I think part of Donald Trump's appeal is that he does talk to voters who disproportionately live, and this is such an exaggeration, but who live in areas that have been either left behind or see themselves as falling behind. And so it wouldn't be surprising that he would get substantial support there. And again, these areas are not generating as much by economic wealth and jobs and things like that. And so, the notion of Donald Trump being a populist to some people is actually quite reasonable. He's fighting for the working guy. We didn't hear that typically, in the higher levels of the campaign. If you saw some of his ads here in Ohio, Donald Trump renegotiated NAFTA, got tough on China. So I think, and that would appeal most to Eastern Ohio. Doesn't appeal to Delaware County or to, the suburbs of Franklin County. So I think makes some sense there, and it talks about a challenge then. Will the Republican Party move forward as a more populist party? Because what has it been in the past stereotypically? The business and Wall Street party. And will the Democrats understand that just because you're talking to your activists on the coasts and in the major cities doesn't mean you're talking to all the people in those areas?
Okay. Richard Needles, who's representing Productive People Strategies, LLC, asks, will the Electoral College be eliminated or revised in the next decade?
Well, given that we would need to amend the Constitution and you would need a supermajority both in the Congress and the state legislators, I wouldn't place money bets on any constitutional amendments being passed. But let me stand up for the Electoral College for a second. The framers, while not perfect, gave a lot of thought to how to form our government, and they knew that if it was a pure popular vote, remember the big division, one of the big divisions of the Constitutional Convention was big state versus small state. We could not have become a country but for the compromise, the great Connecticut Compromise, Roger Sherman, of splitting the legislature in two and giving the Senate uniform representation and the House proportional representation. So given that our country was founded in a balance between large versus small state influence, even though I would say the Constitution won't be amended anytime soon, I would also say it should not be, so that you couldn't have a candidate for president promise all of the federal largesse to California, New York, Texas, Florida, and maybe one other state, win them with 80% of the vote, give all the money to them, and the other 45 states are out of luck. So I don't think, I would pack a lunch if you're waiting on a change in the Electoral College.
Hillary Bates asks, how can non-political institutions like businesses, cultural groups, houses of worship, and others realize their collective power in shoring up norms that support democracy, like a peaceful transition of power, civil and civic conversations like the one we're having today, and honoring public service?
I don't know if any of those groups aren't engaged that way. I think especially when we talk about houses of worship, yes, they're 501c3s, so they can't endorse candidates. They can't endorse issues. But on any given Saturday for some, Sunday for others, when people gather and they listen to their spiritual leaders, they are talking about values that we talk about even in the from a secular perspective. And so they are organizing. I can specifically say for myself, because I lead the political social justice ministry at my church. We did drive-through voter registration. It's not about telling people how to vote, but it is about encouraging them from a spiritual perspective to think about, for those who especially say that they're Christian, they're followers of Christ, is your politics lining up with that? Or are you doing something different politically, but having spiritual values that are counter? So I think even for businesses, having those conversations, and I believe many of them are probably closed door, closed ranks, about their values, what's happening, what the impact actually is, what they believe those groups should, what they believe is necessary to unify for their betterment. But houses of worship that's a very intricate kind of maneuvering. And you have some in terms of evangelicals, because we separate them from everyone else, because there is some question as to whether their values and the way that they mobilize is indicative of what is preached in their houses of worship on any given Sunday. Yes, abortion is an issue, but Christ had so many things to say about so many other issues, and it's not the be-all, end-all. And so there are these conversations, but there are also these sophisticated sermons that are delivered every Sunday in many, that's speaking to it without saying Trump or without saying Biden, and people who read the sacred writings and frequent those houses of worship know exactly what is being discussed, although it's not the conversation we have in the general public. But I believe all those demographics are engaging. It's just they're closed groups, and so they're not public conversations that are open to all of us to actually have a sense of what's happening.
And we have another question back there?
Can I just add one thing to this?
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Businesses have stepped up in the last months on a variety of public issues, including personal safety during COVID. When businesses say wear masks, when they say no mask, no service, they're taking a stand. And they're taking a stand knowing that that position is not popular with some elements of the Republican Party. When businesses get engaged in talking about racial justice, which they have been, they are taking a stand. So then, and there have been really, I mean, there are a lot of wonderful community-based and charitable and development things that businesses do, and they don't have an overtly partisan tone, although some people will see a partisan factor in it. Sorry.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Lee Martin. We spoke here last week about unresponsiveness of elected officials to the constituent groups they represent, particularly in the context of House Bill 6 in Ohio, which doesn't show any sign of being repealed anytime soon. But I just wondered, Ray Miller in particular talked about the importance of drawing the lines. And I'm just wondering what the panelists anticipate this time out when we redistrict in the state of Ohio for congressional districts as well as our legislative districts.
Well, we have some new rules in place in Ohio. This will be the first go-round under the new rules. Yet you can't ignore the fact that redistricting is a political process by definition. Once years ago, I was on Joe Ingles' air with her colleague Bill Cohen, and I said that taking the politics out of redistricting is like taking the tomato out of tomato soup. Redistricting is a political decision by definition, and it is in the hands largely of the General Assembly, not completely under our new rules. And although we have a Republican majority on the Supreme Court, it's a little closer after this current election. And our Chief Justice, I think, voted against the map last time, so if it makes its way to the Supreme Court, it might be a little different. But given that the voters put Republicans in power in all of the statewide offices in the legislature, expect Republicans to have the larger share of the decision-making in that process.
Okay, we have another question back there?
Yeah, we talked about the divisions that have been there for a long time. As a result of the elections, as we flip the conversation to governance, are you any more optimistic around elected officials being more able to engage in dialogue rather than becoming more deeply entrenched in beliefs, already strongly held beliefs?
I think we have the right president to work with a Republican Senate and a Democratic House. And in fact, one could argue that having a Republican Senate gives him a little bit more leverage with the Democratic House, saying you have to understand reality. Relationships are important, but I'm also worried that the longer this goes, I mean, look, the last couple of days, Joe Biden has been the calmest person that I could imagine. He's done, don't worry, we're going to get past this. And, Democratic activists are, sweating, and Republicans who are put in an awkward position say, how long do we have to maintain this so as to gracefully get Donald Trump out of office? They're making the assumption that he would leave office under any circumstances. But I think I'm hopeful that that this is optimistic, but Biden, McConnell, Pelosi can say, okay, look, there's an incentive for us to have in the first 6 months of the new administration some successes that address genuine American problems, but also demonstrate to the people it's not going to be 4 more years of the same thing.
Okay, we're going have to have a very quick question here, very quick answers, so this will be our last one.
So this is my question. Is there a Trump family dynasty? And if so, what's in it for Trump and his family in the long term? Is it ego, power, financial gain, or maybe boredom and entertainment?
Yes.
All of the above.
Yeah, and I think that's rather cynical. I think the Trump family is, at least the president, is willing to serve the country, and he took no pay to do it and left a lucrative career. I do not foresee big careers from any of the Trump family. I think there are many Republican office holders who will step up and be the next generation of leaders, and some of whom are right here in Ohio.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I hope you found today's forum enlightening. Next week, on Wednesday, we'll examine progress towards a COVID vaccine and related issues of distribution. Thanks to our sponsors today, Hannah News Service and the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation. Live streaming is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation with support from the Columbus Dispatch and PNC. To all our online virtual seat patrons, thank you all, and a special thanks to our speakers, Herb Ashe, Trice Washington, Mark Weaver, and Joe Ingles. Let's have a round of applause for them one more time. We hope to see you again soon, and until then, stay well. Thank you.